Human, explain something to me. The alien landlady shouted down the corridor. Why do you have a miniature Shai-Hulud between your legs? The hallway of Draxo's outpost went silent so fast Ethan Carter could hear the low electrical hum of the station's gravity plates vibrating under his boots. A second earlier the corridor had been its usual evening chaos. Cargo haulers rolling past, a trio of insectoid traders arguing over docking fees, and the faint smell of recycled coffee drifting from the communal kitchen. But now every eye, compound or otherwise, had turned toward him. Ethan stood frozen in the doorway of room 214, holding a wrinkled gray towel and wondering how a simple shower had turned into the most humiliating moment of his 32 years on Earth or any other planet. The alien woman standing at the far end of the corridor was nearly 7 feet tall, her smooth blue skin glowing under the station's cold overhead lights, and her copper-colored eyes wide with alarm. Zyra Velthani, proprietor of the cheapest boarding house on Draxo's outpost, pointed one long finger toward Ethan like she had just discovered a dangerous wildlife specimen loose in her building. Ethan blinked twice. His brain, still lagging after 18 straight hours in a cargo shuttle, struggled to process the sentence she had just yelled. "I'm sorry," he said slowly, his voice echoing down the metal corridor. "A miniature what?" Zyra took 2 cautious steps forward, her long coat swaying behind her like a desert banner. "A Shai-Hulud," she repeated with the tone of someone explaining basic physics to a confused child. "A sand leviathan, apex predator of the Varen Dunes. They are extremely dangerous and absolutely should not be carried around inside residential facilities." Behind her, 3 other tenants peeked around the corner of the hallway, their curious faces stacked one above another. One of them, a four-armed mechanic from Tau Ceti, muttered something in a language Ethan's translator politely declined to interpret. Ethan looked down at himself, then back up at Zyra, then down again. Realization crept across his face like sunrise over a very awkward desert. "Oh," he said quietly. "Oh wow. Okay. Yeah, that's not a Shai-Hulud." Zyra's eyes narrowed. "Human," she said with deep suspicion. "Do not attempt humor during a potential biological emergency." The station lights flickered faintly as a cargo freighter docked somewhere outside the hull, sending a low vibration through the floor. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck. This was not how he imagined his first hour living on Draxo's outpost would go. All he had wanted was a cheap room, a hot shower, and maybe 6 hours of uninterrupted sleep before starting his new engineering contract in the morning. Instead, he was standing barefoot in a towel being accused of smuggling alien wildlife into a rental property. "Look," Ethan said carefully, keeping his voice calm the way you might talk to someone who had just mistaken your shoelace for a venomous snake. "That's just part of human anatomy." Zyra froze. The hallway got even quieter somehow. The mechanic from Tau Ceti leaned farther around the corner. "Your species carries reproductive appendages externally?" she asked slowly. Ethan exhaled. "Yep." Zyra stared at him for 3 full seconds, her expression cycling through confusion, scientific curiosity, and what might have been mild horror. Then she lifted a small hollow tablet from her belt and began scrolling rapidly through a xenobiology database. The glow from the screen reflected in her copper eyes as she read. Ethan shifted his weight from one foot to the other while half the building watched. Finally, Zyra looked back up at him. "Human," she said with quiet astonishment. "Your species is far stranger than the rumors suggested." Ethan sighed. "You have no idea." The corridor remained quiet for another long moment before the everyday sounds of Draxo's outpost slowly crept back in like a cautious tide returning to shore. Somewhere down the hall, a ventilation fan rattled inside a metal duct, and the faint scent of ionized coolant drifted from the station maintenance shaft. Ethan Carter cleared his throat and shifted his weight against the doorframe of room 214, while Zyra Velthani continued scrolling through her hollow tablet with the intense concentration of someone discovering an entirely new branch of science. The blue-skinned landlady tilted the glowing screen toward the corridor lights and muttered softly as the translation program parsed human biology articles from the Galactic Knowledge Network. Ethan folded his arms across his chest and waited while 3 curious tenants leaned farther into the hallway to listen. One of them whispered something that sounded suspiciously like a bet. After another 15 seconds, Zyra lowered the tablet slowly and studied Ethan the way a field researcher might examine an unfamiliar species of bird. Human Ethan Carter, she said carefully, reading the name from his rental contract. Your anatomy is statistically unusual compared to the dominant species of this sector. Ethan sighed in relief that the conversation had shifted from mythical sand monsters to basic biology. Yeah, he said, rubbing his tired eyes. We get that reaction a lot out here. Zaira tilted her head slightly, the soft overhead lighting reflecting off the smooth blue curve of her cheekbones. Most advanced civilizations keep reproductive organs internally protected for safety and climate regulation, she continued, speaking in the calm tone of a lecturer explaining planetary weather patterns. Your species places them externally with minimal biological shielding. That seems extremely impractical. Ethan shrugged. Human evolution was never famous for practicality. A faint chuckle came from the mechanic around the corner. Zaira ignored the audience and stepped closer, studying Ethan with open curiosity now instead of alarm. The floor panels vibrated faintly again as another cargo vessel attached to the station's outer ring. Does this design cause frequent medical complications? She asked. Ethan blinked. Not really. Zaira's eyes narrowed again. Then how does your species protect itself during environmental hazards such as desert storms or extreme cold? Ethan thought for a moment and then smiled tiredly. Very carefully. The answer hung in the air for a second before one of the tenants snorted in laughter. Zaira's expression shifted again, this time to something Ethan recognized instantly. It was the same look scientists on Earth got when they realized the universe had just handed them a fascinating new puzzle. She tapped a few commands on her hollow tablet and nodded slowly. According to these records, she said, human physiology compensates with a higher tolerance for environmental variation, strong adaptive behavior, and unusual resilience to embarrassment. Ethan groaned softly. That last part is definitely getting tested tonight. The small group of onlookers finally began drifting back toward their rooms as the excitement faded and normal station life resumed. Zaira slipped the hollow tablet back onto her belt and regarded Ethan with a calmer expression. Human Carter, she said, you may continue your evening routine. I will update the boarding house species registry to reflect this anatomical clarification. Ethan stepped back toward the door with a grateful nod. Thanks. I really appreciate that. Zaira paused, her copper eyes glinting with thoughtful curiosity. However, she added, I must admit something. Ethan hesitated. What is that? The tall landlady folded her arms thoughtfully. Your species is extremely confusing, she said. Ethan smiled weakly. You are only on page 1 of the instruction manual. The door to room 214 slid shut with a soft hydraulic hiss, and Ethan Carter leaned his back against the cool metal panel, staring at the ceiling for a long moment while the quiet hum of the station settled around him again. Draxo's outpost was never truly silent. Somewhere above his room a freight elevator groaned as it lifted several tons of cargo toward the docking ring, and the air recyclers whispered steadily through the vents like mechanical wind moving through steel canyons. Ethan ran a hand through his short blonde hair and let out a tired breath. First day in the galaxy's cheapest boarding house, he muttered to himself, and half the hallway already thinks I am smuggling alien wildlife. He pushed himself away from the door and finally finished getting dressed, pulling on a worn gray t-shirt and a pair of dark cargo pants that had seen better years hauling equipment between star systems. The digital wall clock beside the bed blinked 21:14 station time, which meant his body still believed it was early afternoon back on Earth. Jet lag from interstellar jumps always felt like his brain had been folded inside out. He crossed the small room and opened the narrow viewport that looked out across the station's exterior docking ring. Outside, a forest of antenna towers and cargo cranes stretched into the dark vacuum, their navigation lights blinking red and white against the distant stars. A massive transport slowly rotated past the observation corridor nearly half a mile away, its engines glowing like distant campfires in the black. Ethan watched it drift for a moment and felt a familiar sense of calm settle over him. No matter how strange alien cultures could be, space itself always felt the same. Cold. Quiet. Honest. A soft chime interrupted the moment. Ethan turned toward the door, just as it slid open a few inches, and Zaira Velthani stepped halfway into the room with the cautious posture of someone visiting an unfamiliar laboratory specimen. The tall, blue-skinned landlady looked slightly embarrassed now that the hallway drama had faded. Her copper-colored eyes flicked around the small apartment, noting the neatly stacked tool kit on Ethan's desk and a compact engineering scanner charging beside it. "Human Carter," she said carefully. "I hope my earlier reaction did not cause excessive distress." Ethan leaned against the desk and smiled in a tired but friendly way. "Honestly, it is not the strangest misunderstanding I have had since leaving Earth." Zaira studied him for a second, as if evaluating whether he was serious. "Your species demonstrates remarkable tolerance for social discomfort," she observed. Ethan shrugged. "You learn fast when you work cargo routes. Every station has different customs." Zaira stepped fully into the room now, folding her arms behind her back. "That is precisely why I wish to ask another question." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "About human anatomy again?" Zaira shook her head. "About human behavior." She glanced toward the window where the slow-moving or transport drifted past the stars. "You arrived on this station only 40 minutes ago, yet when the corridor became crowded and embarrassing you remained calm instead of defensive. What?" Ethan considered the question while the distant engines of the cargo ship glowed against the darkness outside. Then he answered in the simplest way he knew. "Because in space," he said quietly, "getting angry at misunderstandings wastes oxygen." Zaira tilted her head slightly, clearly intrigued by the answer. For the first time since their chaotic introduction, the alien landlady smiled just a little. "Human Carter," she said thoughtfully, "your species may be confusing, but it is becoming very interesting." The quiet moment inside room 214 lasted only a few seconds before a low metallic vibration rolled through the floor again, stronger this time, like distant thunder traveling through steel. Ethan Carter felt it through the soles of his boots and glanced toward the ceiling automatically. Years of working cargo routes had trained his instincts to read a station's mood the way sailors read the ocean. Draxo's outpost was shifting into its late-night cycle. Outside the viewport, the massive or transport had finished docking, and a line of smaller service drones floated along its hull, like glowing fireflies repairing sensors and cargo clamps. Zaira Velthani followed Ethan's gaze toward the window, her tall frame silhouetted against the quiet starfield. "Your engineering tools suggest that you are not a typical traveler," she said after a moment. Ethan turned back toward the desk where his compact scanner hummed softly while recharging. "Freight systems engineer," he replied. "Mostly maintenance work. Power grids, life support, docking computers. Anything that keeps stations from falling apart." Zaira nodded slowly, as if that explained several new pieces of information about the human standing in front of her. "Draxo's outpost contains many aging systems," she said. "It was constructed almost 90 years ago during the early expansion period. Maintenance budgets have not always kept pace with the station's growth." Ethan gave a quiet chuckle. "That is a polite way to say things break a lot." Zaira allowed a faint smile. "Yes." For a moment, the only sound in the room was the soft circulation of air through the vents and the distant echo of a cargo loader reversing somewhere far down the docking ring. Then Ethan noticed something else beneath the background noise. A faint irregular clicking inside the wall behind the kitchenette. He tilted his head slightly, listening. Click. Pause. Click, click. The rhythm repeated like a tiny mechanical heartbeat buried behind the metal paneling. Ethan frowned and stepped closer to the wall. Zaira watched him with curiosity. "Is something wrong?" she asked. Ethan placed his palm against the panel and felt the vibration immediately. "Maybe nothing," he said slowly. "But that sound should not be there." Zaira walked over beside him, her copper eyes narrowing as she listened. The clicking grew slightly louder now that both of them focused on it. "That is inside the maintenance conduit," she said after a moment. "Those lines connect to the corridor power distribution." Ethan crouched down and tapped lightly on the metal surface. The clicking stopped for a second. Then it resumed again, faster this time. Ethan sighed quietly and stood up. "I think one of your voltage regulators is cycling wrong," he said. "It is trying to stabilize a power fluctuation." Zaira looked surprised. "You determined that only from listening?" Ethan gave a small shrug. "When you spend 10 years fixing old stations, you start recognizing their bad habits." Zaira studied the wall panel thoughtfully. "If the regulator fails," she asked, What will happen? Ethan folded his arms and glanced toward the ceiling where the corridor lights hummed faintly. Probably nothing dramatic, he said. But if the power spike gets worse, half the hallway could lose lighting and climate control for a while. Zyra considered that carefully. The landlady of the boarding house clearly understood what angry tenants might do if their rooms suddenly lost heat and oxygen. Regulation. She turned back toward Ethan with a thoughtful expression. Human Carter, she said slowly. Would you be willing to examine the regulator system? Ethan smiled faintly. Looks like I already started. Zyra watched him for another moment before nodding once. The strange human she had just met might not understand alien customs, but he seemed to understand machines. And on a station as old as Draxo's outpost, that skill might be more valuable than anyone realized. The faint clicking behind the wall grew slightly louder as Ethan Carter knelt beside the metal panel and reached for the compact engineering scanner resting on his desk. The device hummed to life in his hand with a soft blue glow that reflected across the brushed steel surface of the conduit cover. Zyra Velthani stepped back half a pace to give him room, her tall silhouette framed by the pale light of the room's overhead panels. The air recyclers whispered steadily through the vents, while somewhere far outside the station a docking clamp released with a distant metallic thud that vibrated faintly through the structure. Ethan pressed the scanner against the wall and watched the diagnostic lines ripple across its small display. A moment later he nodded slowly. Yeah, he said quietly. That regulator is definitely struggling. Zyra folded her arms behind her back with careful composure, though her copper-colored eyes followed every movement of the scanner with sharp interest. Is it dangerous? She asked. Ethan shook his head. Not immediately. Think of it like a heartbeat that is slightly out of rhythm. The station is still running, but the system is working harder than it should. The clicking sounded again, faster now, like a nervous clock ticking behind the metal panel. Ethan traced the location with the scanner and tapped the wall with his knuckles. Voltage regulator unit, he explained. Probably original equipment from when the station was built. After 90 years, the calibration coils start drifting. Zyra considered this information with visible concern. Our maintenance teams rarely inspect that section of the corridor grid, she admitted. The system has always appeared stable. Ethan gave a soft chuckle. Machines are polite that way. They keep working until the exact moment they decide they are tired. The scanner chirped softly as it completed another diagnostic sweep. Ethan stood up and reached for the panel's manual release latch. Let us take a look. The cover slid aside with a quiet metallic scrape, revealing a narrow maintenance cavity filled with bundled cables, cooling lines, and a rectangular regulator unit the size of a lunchbox mounted near the back wall. A thin amber light on the regulator blinked unevenly. Click. Pause. Click, click. Ethan leaned closer and listened carefully. The smell of warm circuitry drifted from the compartment, not burned, but strained. The scent every engineer learned to recognize early in their career. Zyra stepped beside him and looked into the opening with fascination. Your hearing detected that problem through an entire wall panel, she said. Ethan shrugged modestly. Old stations talk if you listen long enough. He reached inside the compartment and gently rested 2 fingers on the regulator housing. The vibration confirmed his suspicion instantly. Power fluctuation from the docking grid, he said. Probably caused by that or transport we saw earlier. Big ships draw a lot of energy when they connect. Zyra glanced toward the viewport where the distant cargo vessel still hovered like a silent mountain of steel. Can it be repaired? She asked. Ethan nodded slowly. Yes. The system just needs recalibration before the cycle worsens. He pulled a slim multi-tool from his belt and adjusted a small control dial on the regulator casing. The clicking slowed immediately. Click. Pause. Click. The rhythm settled into a steady mechanical pulse. Ethan closed the panel again and wiped his hands on a cloth from his toolkit. That should stabilize it for now, he said. Zyra watched the wall thoughtfully for several seconds before turning back toward him. The concern in her eyes had shifted into something else now, a quiet respect mixed with curiosity. Human Carter, she said slowly. You arrived on this station less than 1 hour ago, and you have already repaired a problem our maintenance logs never detected. Ethan leaned against the desk and smiled in a relaxed way. Machines are easier to understand than people. Zyra considered that statement carefully. Then she gave a small nod. Perhaps that is why your species survives in so many unfamiliar places. The soft clicking behind the wall had faded into a calm, steady pulse, and for the first time since Ethan Carter arrived at Draxo's outpost, the corridor power grid sounded healthy again. The air inside room 214 felt quieter now, almost relaxed, as if the station itself had taken a deep mechanical breath. Ethan set his engineering scanner back on the desk where its charging light glowed a steady green, then leaned his shoulder against the metal cabinet and stretched his arms slightly to loosen the stiffness from hours inside a cargo shuttle seat. Outside the narrow viewport, the stars drifted slowly as the station rotated along its orbital path around the distant gas giant that dominated this sector of space. The enormous planet filled half the sky like a swirling ocean of amber clouds and lightning storms thousands of miles wide. Zaira Velthani stood near the window watching the view in thoughtful silence. The blue tone of her skin reflected faintly in the glass as the distant lightning flickered across the planet's atmosphere. After a few moments, she spoke again. "Human Carter," she said calmly. "I must update my earlier evaluation." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "That sounds official." Zaira turned toward him, her copper-colored eyes steady and curious. "When you arrived tonight, I believed you were simply another transient worker passing through the station. Someone who would occupy a room briefly and leave without changing anything." Ethan smiled faintly. "That is still the plan." Zaira tilted her head slightly. "Perhaps. But within 1 hour you have corrected a power instability that our maintenance logs did not even register. That indicates a level of observation and experience that is unusual." Ethan folded his arms loosely across his chest and glanced toward the closed wall panel where the regulator quietly maintained its rhythm. "On Earth we say machines always give you a warning before they fail," he said. "Most people just do not notice it." Zaira considered that carefully. The alien landlady had the posture of someone who was slowly assembling a new understanding of the human species piece by piece. "Your people rely heavily on instinct and pattern recognition," she said thoughtfully. "Yes," Ethan replied. "We are very good at noticing when something feels wrong." The distant thunder of cargo clamps echoed faintly through the station structure as another ship prepared to depart. The vibration traveled through the floor panels like the slow heartbeat of the enormous facility. Zaira listened to the sound for a moment and then looked back toward Ethan again. "There are many species in this sector that consider humans unpredictable," she said. "Some even consider them reckless." Ethan gave a small shrug. "That reputation follows us everywhere." Zaira's expression softened slightly, almost amused. "After observing you tonight, I believe the description is incomplete." Ethan leaned forward a little. "What would you call it instead?" Zaira gestured gently toward the repaired wall panel. "Adaptable," she said. "Your species may appear chaotic at first glance, but beneath that behavior there is a remarkable ability to adjust to unfamiliar environments." Ethan smiled quietly at the description. "That is how humans survived our own planet," he said. "Earth is not exactly a calm place." Zaira glanced again toward the storm-filled gas giant outside the window where lightning crawled across the distant clouds. Then she returned her attention to the human engineer standing in the small room. "Draxo's outpost is also not a calm place," she said thoughtfully. Ethan chuckled softly. "Most space stations are not." Zaira studied him for another moment before nodding once. "Then perhaps it is fortunate that a human engineer chose my boarding house tonight." Ethan rested his hands in his pockets and looked out at the quiet stars beyond the glass. For the first time since arriving, he felt the strange station beginning to feel a little less unfamiliar. Sometimes all it took was fixing one small machine to make a place start feeling like home. The quiet comfort inside room 214 lasted only a few minutes before a sharp electronic tone echoed through the corridor speakers outside. The sound was not loud, but it carried a precise mechanical urgency that instantly caught Ethan Carter's attention. His head tilted slightly toward the door as the tone repeated again, followed by a calm automated announcement drifting through the hallway speakers. "Docking ring 3 power fluctuation detected. Maintenance crews please stand by." Ethan slowly exhaled through his nose and glanced toward the wall panel where he had just adjusted the regulator. The metal remained silent, the steady internal hum confirming his repair was still holding. Zaira Velthani also heard the announcement and turned toward the door with a faint crease of concern across her blue brow. That message does not usually occur during standard docking operations, she said quietly. Ethan nodded once. Yeah, that means the power surge came from somewhere else. The faint vibration of the station shifted again beneath their feet, this time carrying a slightly irregular rhythm through the floor plates. Ethan had spent enough years inside aging orbital infrastructure to recognize the feeling immediately. It was the sensation of a system working harder than expected. He stepped toward the viewport and looked out across the docking ring, where several cargo ships floated like steel islands under the station lights. One of the smaller service barges was rotating slowly while several maintenance drones circled it like cautious insects. Something down there just drew a lot of energy from the grid, Ethan said calmly. Zyra joined him beside the window and followed his gaze. The distant docking structures glowed with white navigation lights against the blackness of space, while the giant gas planet beyond continued its endless storm cycle in silence. Our station grid is designed to absorb fluctuations, she said. But the warning suggests the system did not compensate correctly. Ethan crossed his arms thoughtfully. Your regulator problem might have been part of a bigger pattern. Zyra looked toward him with renewed curiosity. You believe the station power grid is unstable? Ethan gave a slow shrug. Not unstable yet, but it is behaving like a tired machine that is trying to keep up with more demand than it was designed for. The corridor speaker chimed again. This time the announcement sounded slightly more urgent. Secondary diagnostics in progress. Non-essential systems may temporarily cycle. The room lights dimmed for half a second before returning to full brightness. Zyra watched the ceiling panels carefully. That rarely happens, she admitted. Ethan smiled faintly in a way that suggested he had seen this situation many times before. Power grids have personalities, he said. Right now yours is complaining. Zyra folded her arms behind her back and studied the human engineer thoughtfully. Human Carter, she said after a moment. If the station grid continues to fluctuate, could it affect the residential sector? Ethan nodded. Possibly. Climate control, corridor lighting, maybe some docking sensors. Zyra glanced toward the door, as if imagining several dozen irritated tenants emerging into the hallway at the same time. That would be inconvenient. Ethan chuckled softly. That is one word for it. The speaker system crackled again in the corridor, but this time the announcement was shorter. Maintenance teams report delayed response. Engineering assistance requested. Zyra slowly turned her head toward Ethan. The expression in her copper-colored eyes had changed again, shifting from curiosity to something closer to recognition. Human Carter, she said quietly. I believe the station is asking for someone who understands machines. Ethan looked out at the distant service drones circling the troubled cargo barge, then back toward the calm landlady standing beside him. He took a slow breath and gave a relaxed nod. Good thing I just moved in. The corridor lights dimmed again for a brief moment before stabilizing, and the soft hum of Draxo's outpost shifted into a slightly strained rhythm that Ethan Carter immediately recognized. It was the sound of a station pushing its aging systems just a little too hard. He stepped away from the viewport and reached for his engineering scanner, while Zyra Velthani watched him with quiet focus. Outside the narrow window, the service drones near the cargo barge had multiplied, small bright sparks of motion moving along the hull, as if the station itself had suddenly realized something was wrong. Another announcement crackled through the corridor speakers, this time carrying a subtle edge of urgency. Engineering assistance requested for docking ring 3 power stabilization. Temporary load balancing in progress. Ethan clipped the scanner to his belt and grabbed a compact diagnostic pad from his toolkit. That means the automatic systems are struggling to keep the grid balanced, he said calmly. Zyra nodded once, her tall frame moving toward the doorway. The central maintenance access for this residential sector connects to the docking ring service corridor 2 levels below, she said. If the fluctuation originates from the cargo grid, we can observe the problem from there. Ethan smiled slightly. Sounds like a plan. The door slid open with a soft mechanical hiss, and the two stepped into the hallway where the atmosphere had changed noticeably since earlier that evening. A few curious tenants stood outside their rooms now, glancing toward the ceiling lights as they flickered faintly before stabilizing again. The four-armed mechanic from Tau Ceti leaned against the wall and gave Ethan an amused nod. Human engineer, the mechanic said. Your arrival has created an interesting night. Ethan shrugged good-naturedly as he walked past. Machines like to greet new people dramatically. Zyra led the way down the corridor toward the main stairwell where the station's background sounds grew louder with every step. The deep mechanical heartbeat of the power grid echoed through the structure, while ventilation systems adjusted airflow across multiple decks. As they descended the metal stairs, the air grew slightly cooler, and the smell of heated circuitry drifted faintly through the corridor. Ethan paused at the bottom landing and placed his palm lightly against the wall panel. The vibration confirmed what his instincts had already suspected. Power load is spiking every 20 seconds, he said thoughtfully. Zyra watched him carefully. What does that indicate? Ethan lifted his scanner and checked the reading. A graph of fluctuating energy levels pulsed across the screen like a nervous heartbeat. Something on the docking ring is drawing power in repeating bursts, he explained. Probably a large system trying to start up, but failing to stabilize. Zyra's copper-colored eyes reflected the faint light from the scanner display. Could that affect life support systems? She asked quietly. Ethan shook his head reassuringly. Not yet. The station grid is built with multiple layers of protection. But if the cycle continues long enough, it could overload smaller distribution nodes. They stepped through a wide maintenance hatch that opened onto the service corridor overlooking docking ring 3. Through the reinforced observation window, the massive cargo barge from earlier hovered beside the station, while several maintenance teams floated around it in powered suits. Even from this distance, Ethan could see the problem. The barge's auxiliary reactor pulsed with uneven light, each burst of energy pushing a spike into the station grid before fading again. Ethan let out a slow breath. There it is, he said quietly. Zyra studied the distant vessel with growing understanding. The cargo ship is the source. Ethan nodded once. Its startup cycle is unstable. Every time the reactor tries to synchronize with the station grid, it dumps a surge of energy into the system. Zyra folded her arms behind her back, her posture calm but attentive. Can it be corrected? Ethan watched the flickering reactor for another moment, and then smiled slightly in the relaxed way of someone who had solved this kind of puzzle many times before. Yeah, he said. But someone has to teach that ship how to behave. The auxiliary reactor on the cargo barge pulsed again, a dull flare of blue light spreading across its hull before fading back into shadow, and the entire structure of Draxo's outpost answered with a faint vibration that rolled through the service corridor floor. Ethan Carter watched the rhythm for several seconds through the observation window, his engineering instincts quietly measuring the pattern like a musician listening to a song that had fallen out of tempo. Zyra Velthani stood beside him in calm silence while the maintenance crews outside drifted around the vessel with cautious movements, their suit lights tracing slow arcs in the darkness. The reactor is attempting to synchronize with the station grid, Ethan said finally, his voice steady and thoughtful. But its startup sequence is misaligned by a fraction of a second. Zyra studied the flickering engine glow with focused curiosity. A fraction of a second can disrupt the entire power system, she asked. Ethan gave a small nod. In machines this large, timing is everything. He lifted his diagnostic pad and connected it to the station's maintenance network through the wall console beside the window. The screen filled with flowing streams of technical data, energy levels rising and falling in repeating spikes every 20 seconds, just as he predicted. See that? He said, tilting the display slightly so Zyra could see the fluctuating graph. Every time the reactor tries to stabilize, it pushes a surge into the grid instead. Zyra leaned slightly closer, her copper eyes reflecting the glow of the diagnostic screen. Then the solution is to correct the synchronization. Ethan smiled faintly. Exactly. He tapped several commands into the interface, accessing the cargo barge's external diagnostic channel. A moment later, the reactor telemetry appeared beside the station grid data. The mismatch was obvious now, two energy rhythms drifting slightly apart like dancers who had missed the beat of the music. Ethan adjusted the timing sequence through the remote maintenance protocol and then paused, watching the graphs carefully. The reactor pulsed again outside the window. This time the surge climbed smoothly instead of spiking. The station floor beneath them settled into a quieter hum. Zyra lifted her head slightly as the corridor lights stabilized completely. Another pulse followed, then another, each one aligned perfectly with the station's power rhythm. Ethan exhaled slowly and leaned back from the console. That should do it. Outside, the maintenance drones began drifting away from the cargo vessel as its reactor glow steadied into a calm, constant light. The corridor speakers crackled once more, but the announcement carried a different tone now. Docking ring 3 power stabilization successful. Engineering thanks all assisting personnel. Zyra watched the steady reactor glow through the window for several seconds before turning back toward Ethan. The curiosity in her expression had changed again, settling into quiet admiration. Human Carter, she said thoughtfully. You arrived on this station less than 2 hours ago. Ethan slipped the diagnostic pad back into his tool belt. Sounds about right. Zyra gestured toward the silent reactor beyond the glass. And already you have prevented a station-wide power disruption. Ethan shrugged lightly. Just good timing. Zyra studied him for a moment longer, then allowed herself a small, genuine smile. Earlier tonight, she said, I believed humans were confusing creatures driven by unusual biology and unpredictable behavior. Ethan laughed softly. We still are. Zyra nodded once in agreement. Perhaps, she said. But now I understand something else about your species. Ethan glanced toward the calm starfield beyond the docking ring. What is that? Zyra looked back at the steady lights of Draxo's outpost humming peacefully around them. When something in the universe stops working, she said quietly, a human will always try to fix it. Ethan smiled at the simple truth in her words. Outside the observation window, the cargo barge's reactor burned steadily, while the great gas giant continued its endless silent storms far beyond the station. And somewhere deep inside the walls of Draxo's outpost, the machines were finally breathing in rhythm again.